Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the distinguished panel that has appeared before us. And Professor Stevenson, it's great to see you. I want to start with Professor Otis. Criminal justice is largely the province of 50 states. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And that's consistent, of course, with the constitutional landscape and the fact that prevention of crime wasn't necessarily an enumerated power given to Congress. It was left to the state. The 10th Amendment obviously factors into that. And the majority of individuals who are incarcerated in this country right now are in the state penal system. Is that correct?
That is also correct. Only about 217,000 are in the federal prisons.
So the state experience is a relevant indicator of what could potentially happen if criminal justice reform occurs, correct?
That is correct with the qualification, and the qualification is one that I would say I build on Mr. Evanson's experience as well as my own as an assistant U.S. attorney. The federal prison population is not like the state prison population. The states turn over to the feds the really tough, broad-ranging conspiracies. And the kind of people you find in federal prisons are the ones the state didn't have the toughness or the resources or the sentencing system to deal with.
Okay, that's interesting because about 50% of the federal prison population actually constitutes nonviolent drug offenders, many of whom did not have a prior criminal record or engaged in violent criminal activity prior to them being incarcerated in federal prison. Is that correct, Mr. Stevenson?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Now, in fact, about 10% of the prison population in the federal system actually are violent offenders. In fact, I think that's less than 10%. Mr. Stevenson, is that correct?
That's correct.
So the premise that the federal system is somehow different in nature and is filled with kingpins and mafia lords and terrorists is just inconsistent with the facts. Is that fair, Mr. Stevenson?
Yes, and the U.S. Sentencing Commission has made that point repeatedly in its assessment of who is doing time in the federal system.
So I think it's clear there is no real difference between the individuals in the state penal system and the individuals in the federal penal system. And so I would argue, since the majority of individuals are actually in the state penal system, that the state penal system experience in terms of criminal justice reform is instructive. To me, that seems like a reasonable premise. But, Mr. Levin, does that seem fair?
Well, I think it is. There are obviously some differences in the composition, but frankly, those have lessened over the years as more and more, frankly, low-level street corner drug offenders have ended up in the federal system. And I would also say one of the provisions of the Smarter Sentencing Act would say you could have 2 criminal history points instead of 1 and still be able to get the benefit of the safety valve. Now, but in order to get the safety valve, you have to cooperate. And so that would actually increase the incentive to cooperate for more people, right? Because now if you have at least 2 criminal history points, you can't get the safety valve anyway.
Let me stop you there because my time is limited, but I appreciate that observation. Now, 29 states, as Mr. Stevenson pointed out, have limited or restricted mandatory minimums. And I would think, based on some of the testimony that we've heard today, that that perhaps would have resulted in a crime wave being unleashed on the good people of America in those 29 states. Has that been the experience, Mr. Stevenson?
No, it's not. And as was indicated, some states have actually seen dramatic increases in their crime reduction after the passage of these reforms.
Okay, Mr. Otis, are you familiar with the Rockefeller drug laws that were first put into place in New York State in the 1970s?
Generally, but not in specifics.
Okay, and it's widely understood that these were some of the most restrictive, punitive drug laws anywhere in this country, correct?
I would have to defer to you.
Okay, Mr. Stevenson, is that correct?
That is correct, Your Honor.
Okay, now, these had some of the toughest, most draconian mandatory minimums related to nonviolent drug offenders. In 2009, I was in the state legislature. I was pleased to be part of the effort to dramatically reform those Rockefeller drug laws. This happened in 2009. Are you familiar with that, Mr. Otis?
I am not.
Okay, well, it occurred. Familiar with that, Mr. Levin?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Now, again, based on this premise, I would assume in New York State that a dramatic crime wave, as some argued would have occurred, as a result of the reforms that took place, would follow. Is that what took place in New York State, Mr. Otis, or did the crime actually continue to decline subsequent to the repeal of the Rockefeller drug laws in New York, as has been the experience in every other state that has changed or reformed its mandatory minimums?
My answer to that is going to be a little bit long, but you have to forgive me, I am a law professor after all. The answer is that, yes, in the states that have experimented in this way, crime has continued to decline, but that is because imprisonment and the use of imprisonment, while very significant, probably the most significant factor in the overall decrease in crime in this country in the last 20 years, is only one factor. Other factors are at work as well, and those factors have continued to be in play. Other factors like hiring more police, better police training, better private security measures, better EMT care to reduce the murder rate, for example. So while it is true that crime has continued to decrease, the decrease has been at a lower rate in the states in which they've tried this. And the best example is California.
My time is expired, but let me just make the observation. One of the reasons that states have been able to invest resources in those other areas that you enumerated is because when you reduce the prison population, you reduce the state budgetary burden, and you can actually invest in things that have been empirically proven to lower crime. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffries. At this time, we would move to the gentleman from North Carolina. Mr. Holdings, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Evanson, I'd like for you to give us some, real life, frontline context. First, just to establish, in your 20-plus years as a prosecutor, most of that as a drug prosecutor, how many drug defendants